Hey, everybody, welcome back to Wild Connection, the podcast. What makes something or someone belong? It's a question we often ask about nature. We label species as native or invasive, welcome or unwelcomed, beneficial or harmful. But beneath those labels is something deeper: how we decide what fits into our world and what we push away. Today, we take that idea beyond ecology and into human history. Our guest, George Makari, author of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia, explores how fear of the other has shaped societies, policies, and relationships throughout history. How do these patterns of exclusion echo across both the natural world and human culture? That is what we're talking about today. Welcome to Wild Connection, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Vertelen. I'm a scientist and author that studies animal behavior. I'm passionate about animals and exploring the complexity of their lives, their intelligence, relationships, families, social connections, and emotions. I also love helping people reconnect with nature to live better lives. This podcast is about you, other animals, and how we're all connected in this wild and crazy thing called life. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of Wild Connection, the podcast. Today, I am really excited to bring to you Dr. Makari, who is the author of a recent book called Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia. And he is also a practicing psychiatrist and the director of the DeWitt Wallace Institute of Psychiatry at the Weill Cornell Medical College. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, I'm really interested. You've done a lot of, you're a historian as well as a psychiatrist, and you've published a few books, but this one really grabbed me because I think about our current sort of social climate and some of the language that's always being used these days around foreigners or immigrants. And before we dive into your book, I was wondering if you would share with the audience a little bit about how you became interested in medicine and specifically the field of psychiatry.
Oh, okay. Medicine. You're telling me to go back some ways in time. Okay. So my dad is a research scientist who is a doctor. He was obviously an important role model. He loved his work. Both of my sisters are doctors. So I come from a family of doctors, and I was probably a little bit outside the mold because I was really more interested in literature and writing and history. But, you know, I can give you the long version or the short version of this. Which one do you want? I mean,
you can give whatever version you want. Okay. This show's about you.
I had this extraordinary thing happen to me. I've just been thinking about it recently, which is in high school, I applied to college, and there was a school that I wanted to go to. And there was simply a checkbox that you could check if you wanted to see if you could get into their medical school at the same time. And I checked it, but I really didn't think I wanted to go to medical school. But the catastrophe occurred and I got in. And so I was now in the school I wanted to go to, in the medical school, as an 18-year-old who didn't know what the hell they wanted to do. And long story short, it turned out that with a winding road, I realized that psychiatry was a really good mix of my interests in, the written word, in narrative, in history and intellectual history, which I studied a good deal, and in healing and taking care of people. So long and winding road, I end up in psychiatry, and then I end up at Weill Cornell, where they have an institute that really allowed is an interdisciplinary humanistic institute that I have been lucky enough to be the director of for the last bunch of years, that brings together people from the academy and the humanities, and psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, psychologists, philosophers, historians. And so, yeah, I found my people. And so I was very, very fortunate to find my way to Cornell and to the DeWitt Wallace Institute. That's how my disparate interests kind of came together for me.
That's really inspiring, because I think that one of the things I really like about the way what you just said is that you're integrating all these different interests, and so you can sort of take a holistic way of being in your work, and that is something that I think we seem to silo. You have to be an expert in a very narrow field, and I always think of it as a generalist versus specialist. Even in other animals, the cheetah and the panda will not survive because they're too specialized, and we're not that. We're whole people who have very different interests, and bring them together. So I love that about your story.
So
Now,
does that mean I'm not a cheetah or a panda? I'm like a squirrel or something like that.
well, maybe not. Yeah, you're like a squirrel, but you might diversify your food source. So
No, I love that analogy. No, look, I totally agree, and it's both an advantage and a disadvantage in our culture, because being interdisciplinary means that you are maybe in between silos. That gives you the opportunity to ask questions that people inside the silos don't ask, because they're just not on their radar. It's not how you get ahead professionally. They don't ask them. It also means that so the possibilities are, really rich if you have enough. And look, you can't be an amateur. You have to really do your homework and be prepared to be just as professional as anybody in either of those domains. But if you do that, the possibilities to ask questions that other people don't ask is really exciting. The downside is that they ignore you sometimes, and they're in their silo, and so the work can kind of fall in between kind of reading communities, and so you have to accept that that's also part of the package.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And as I was told once, I fall between the stools. And sometimes people don't know what to do with that.
Exactly. But then you have to try. But then ultimately you have to have faith that if it's an interesting question and if you do good work, that it will ultimately land. And I'm hoping that that's how you felt about this book, because it is quite synthetic in a lot of ways.
That's right. And I really, so now I would love to talk about Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia. But the first thing I want to ask you about that is, what led to your interest in that particular topic?
Right. Yeah. Look, I think that it wasn't on my radar really, consciously at least. I had just finished a book. My second book is called Soul Machine: The History of the Modern Mind, and so it's this really big kind of synthetic history of how the natural mind emerged from debates about soul and brain in the Enlightenment. And, the book ends really in the mid 19th century somewhere. So, how does that possibly lead to this? Well, I went to London to promote the book, and I was there with some friends, and it was 2016, and I was asking them, like, what's going on in England. I heard some weird stuff in a sweater store about the Turks are invading, and they said, oh, there's this crazy thing, this Brexit thing that's being, voted on, and don't worry, it's never going to pass, and lo and behold, it passes. And then, we have the 2016 election where a lot of xenophobia is being used to promote the candidacy of Donald Trump. And xenophobia becomes the word of the year. That came later, but what happened to me was I started to think about this in a very weird context that ultimately it might be interesting to you thinking about animals, but I was fascinated with the other mind problem. This is a philosophical problem about how one mind knows another, and especially how one mind knows another, in your case, like without symbolic language. And so I was thinking about that, and I had to meet my agent in London, and I was like, oh, they're going to ask me what I'm doing next. I have no idea. And I said something about the other mind problem. I'm sure it sounded ridiculous and totally abstract. But then I thought, okay, the other mind problem, which I've studied at length and know the history of, is actually related to the kinds of problems of misknowing an other and misknowing their subjectivity and the contents of their inner life, and this is actually something I know something about, right? So I felt like actually I wouldn't be completely reinventing the wheel. I had some of the background that I had. My first book was a history of psychoanalysis. The second book was a history of the making of the natural mind and psychiatry, a lot of it. A lot of that stuff actually was going to help me maybe understand this thing that everyone's talking about called xenophobia, which when you think about it, as a historian of psychiatry, it has phobia in it. So
Yes.
like maybe there's a medical element and it's xenophobia. So it sounds like it's kind of close to paranoia. And I know a lot about the history of paranoia. And so I started to research it. And then I realized, okay, no one has written a history of this. No one actually knows anything about where it comes from because most people say it comes from antiquity. You know, the two Greek roots, xenos, phobos. And if you look at histories of racism and whatnot, they will say xenophobia, an ancient word, an ancient concept that goes back to Greek antiquity. Well, lo and behold, there's no record that it was ever used in antiquity. And so I discovered that. And then I discovered, oh, wait, actually, the origin of the word, it was coined in the 19th century. And now I'm feeling much more comfortable because, like, I knew if it was anything to do in antiquity, I can't read Greek, and much less ancient Greek. And, like, you know, it was going to be out of my league. But once it became a 19th century European story, which is what it turned out to be,
Yeah.
then I was off to the races.
Well, okay, I think what would be helpful for listeners is to, frame and provide context for what exactly is xenophobia, because if I'm not mistaken, you make a distinction between xenophobia and anxiety and stress or aggression towards strangers. And so, what is I think people equate fear of strangers with xenophobia, but is it something different?
Yeah. Look, that was one of the challenges of the book is that I got the impression that there were way too many things packed into this word and they had accrued over time historically. And so if we looked at history, we could unpack them kind of like, Russian dolls or like, something that gets coat after coat after coat of paint. If you undo that, you start to realize, oh, there's this rather discrete but very coherent meaning. And then there's this other rather discrete and coherent meaning. And after a few of those, you pile them all into the same word, and the whole thing is gobbledygook. So many different things can mean xenophobia. And
Okay.
so at the end of the book, I really say, look, this is one way after this kind of critical historical analysis of taking the pieces that we discovered and giving them a little bit of categorical kind of separateness. And so, yeah, I do try to make a distinction between what is, I think, common to animals, and you can tell me about whether that's right or not, and humans, which is the frisson of anxiety when you see a stranger.
Yeah.
That's just natural. And it is, in humans, I tied it to the other mind problem. Like you don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what they might do to you. You have a level of discomfort because they speak a different language or have different customs. And that, I call it other anxiety. And I say it's just part of life. It's part of being human.
Yeah.
And we have ways of managing it and of tempering it and making sure that it doesn't go off into really really kind of hostile imaginings. And that's conversation, dialogue.
Yeah.
I talk about the process of recognition, which is this philosophical concept by which I recognize your subjectivity and I make space for it, and so you're not the other, and neither am I, and we have a dialogue of mutual recognition. And so, in a relatively, safe environment where there's not a lot of threat and there's not a lot of conflict, we do that all the time. And so, yes, that happens. I think you're going to tell me with the animals that you study too, right?
Oh, for sure. And a lot of things were coming up for me because on the one hand, if you're going to study wild animals, you have to what we call habituate them to people. And this could be necessary either because they have a fear of past interactions that were negative, and you have to sort of overcome that and create a sense of safety. Or it's even true for other for species that have never or individuals within a species that have never seen a person. And so you're a definite other. And you can also see that tension arise within groups that of the same species when they encounter another group. They might have an alertness, they might have a stress, they might have aggression. Now, I think about that in terms of intergroup competition. And when that is stronger than the benefits of cooperating, you see this aggression towards strange groups. So, for example, I also looked at brown capuchin monkeys when I was a PhD student, and there you have severe intergroup competition, but this is over resources. And so, how do we reconcile? Is there any component of this otherness aggression or otherness discomfort that extends beyond you're just different than me to you are potentially a competitor for limited resources? And then how has xenophobia sort of fit into that framework?
Yeah, look, I think that those are two kind of rule outs. Before we call people xenophobic, I suggest that there are two important things that we have to ensure. One is this isn't simply a direct competition between groups for resources. And so I say, like, if you live in a town and, there is enough food to feed 50 people and 50 new immigrants move in and you have 50 people, that's a fight over resources. And I think it doesn't necessarily imply anything about the xenos. It implies that we fight over resources. I also think that, at least in the human dimension, that cultural defending, kind of integrated cultures from significant alteration should be thought of in that way, not necessarily through xenophobia. So if you have a town and it's kind of hollowed out, and there are 3 churches and 100 new either mosques or synagogues or temples move in, that's going to cause attention about what's the nature of our identity. And I think also there's no reason to call that xenophobic. You should call that a kind of cultural competition.
Yeah.
But I guess you had this critical moment in your discussion of competition versus cooperation, when the benefits of competition outweigh the benefits of cooperation. And xenophobia really is when the benefits of cooperation might be higher, but it doesn't matter. That's really why it's a phobia. Phobia, phobos in Greek, is just fear. But phobia, and I kind of talk about this in the book, ever since around the 1870s, meant irrational fear. So xenophobia, by definition, is an irrational fear of strangers, where, in fact, cooperating might bring more benefits.
Right.
And that's why it becomes such a problem, both for individuals and for groups.
Right. And that's where I think I start to think in evolutionary terms, cost benefit analysis. It's really maladaptive to engage in xenophobia when there's benefits to cooperating. And one of the things that we see in other species is you don't tend to have this. Well, if you have maladaptive behaviors where you're behaving in ways against your own interest, things don't tend to go well for you. And so, right, those particular individuals don't really survive.
Right.
The other thing that kind of came up for me that was really interesting when you were talking about this distinction of sort of, it's natural to have a sense of tension about others and cultural differences. It might be strange. It's really interesting because orcas, killer whales came up for me because we know that there's communication and linguistic differences between different populations of killer whales. They communicate differently, they feed differently, they have different levels of social interaction. So we call that sort of cultural differences between killer whale populations. And that historic documentary, Blackfish, was really about one of the big problems was they didn't communicate in the same way. And so that particular orca couldn't integrate with the other killer whales. And
so they wouldn't accept that this is a single orca that wouldn't be accepted into the group.
Yeah. And the same thing. So what's interesting in chimpanzees, there's different cultural traditions that occur in different populations or different communities. And when a chimp immigrates into a new community, it tends to adopt some of the, it's sort of like code switching or matching into the environment that you go into. So the thing that struck me was, okay, what I'm remembering is they had a particular way of grooming by holding each other's arm up. Your listeners can't see this. And they would groom each other's armpits. And so when you came into that community, if you came from a community that didn't do that, you tended to learn to do that, right? So you matched some of the cultural traditions that belong to the community you move into. And so how much of a resistance do we as humans have to sort of, we want to keep our own and we want to integrate? And what is that tension and how does that contribute to some of the problems we see?
Yeah, look, those are great examples. But let me just backtrack for a second, because it's great to hear you talk about this, because I am used to very reductive evolutionary psychologists who don't even consider cultural forces like the ones that you're talking about and learned experiences. So one of the, the immediate rejoinders to my book is, in fact, competition is hardwired. They love to use the word hardwired. Evolution made us hardwired to compete, and therefore xenophobia is natural.
Yeah.
As you say, actually, people who are xenophobic don't thrive. They're the people who are like in the jungle in Manila 40 years after World War II has ended, thinking the war is still going on.
Exactly.
They're not New York City or wherever you are, where, there are millions of people from all sorts of different walks of life who are getting along together and thriving because it's in their benefit to do so. So cooperation, I think, has been understudied and undervalued. And so I say in the book, actually cooperation is just as biologically mandated as competition. So now we have a question of why one kicks in, when and where one kicks in, and why it doesn't, and when and where it doesn't. And that becomes a historical question, right? That means that we have the capacity to cooperate. We have the capacity to be ruthlessly competitive, even not in our own self-interest. Why now? Why here? Why not there?
Right.
So, look, I think that does raise interesting questions about, that some of the examples you used about how mastery over certain kinds of signals, I guess that arm cleaning thing is kind of a cultural symbol of group, of being in the group,
right.
And that if a stranger starts to do that, that's precisely what I meant by recognition. That's maybe the chimp's version of, oh, I listened to you tell about your story, and I'm not so scared of you anymore.
Right.
So I do think that's really, really important. The more troubling, difficult things happen when you have an association to a threat from the past. So what if, and you could tell me what animal group this works with, there has been an attack by a group somewhere in the past, and then how much can you relearn that most of that group is actually not hostile, and that was one who had some sort of kuru or whatever and went crazy on your tribe?
Yeah.
You do that. And so that we also have a lot of answers for. And you used the word before, habituation. Behaviorism has given us an answer about how, and I talked about these studies in the 20s and 30s about people talking about ethnic groups that were immigrants. And some of them had a bad experience when they were kids. And this one woman said, a Chinese man followed me into the woods. I had to run and get away from him. Ever since then, I've been scared and hated Asians. And so, what do you do with that? Well, we know what to do with that. You have that person go to school with Asians, play on sports teams, maybe go out on dates, and suddenly they realize that experience doesn't generalize. So that's the habituating process. And it sounds like, in the animal kingdom, you've noticed that the same thing can happen. But if you don't, in some way oblige, if you she ends up going to school with someone who's really hostile, like someone who's not doing that underarm, I'm having trouble with the underarm washing ritual. That old association is still going to lead to fight or flight.
Well, yeah. And so what's really interesting, right, is I think, and I'm not a psychiatrist and I don't play one on TV. So I think when we deal with phobias, so I'll just share, the audience probably doesn't know this, but I had severe PTSD after a car accident. And I had these irrational phobias of certain things that were linked to that particular event. And so I had to gradually habituate myself so that I increased my tolerance. And I know that they might do this with like spider phobias or height phobias. You could do it flooding where you just, completely overwhelm the system. That doesn't work for me. For me, I'm much more of a gradual. I guess I'm much more like a mountain gorilla because it took 2 years, roughly 2 to 3 years to habituate mountain gorillas to accept the presence of humans, because in the past they had been hunted with spears. And what you see now is that they have learned that the majority of people are harmless as long as we don't carry sticks. So when you come as a tourist to see mountain gorillas, you must leave your walking stick behind. When you are now about to go to see the gorillas, you leave your walking stick, because that association has never been broken. Meaning you can undo certain parts. Well, and of course, right? And so this goes into trauma, but I'm thinking about, do you think that, since you mentioned that xenophobia emerged as a phrase or as a word in the 19th century, do you think that historically this has been used for political power and gain? Meaning, have those in power capitalized on sort of the innate fear of strangers and strangeness that we have and transformed it into xenophobia through certain language or other activities? I don't know if I'm asking that well, or if you catch my meaning.
You are, but let me take that second, because the first thing I wanted to say was that your experience with PTSD is very, very relevant. If you think about it individually, you do what you did. If you think about it more socially, that, what is the project of desegregation and integration when you think about xenophobia? And I don't mean just black and white, but I mean a whole host of immigrants and us. That's what it's all about. It's about bringing people together in a gradual way. Now, you might say if you're in a super racist community, it is flooding. And so there will be a lot of pushback. But the notion of integration and desegregation, Brown versus Board of Education, they were thinking about this. They were relying in part on children and psychology and the way that, it had affected Black children. So, and then, this is probably harder to do with your animals, but we also know that unconscious bias is a cognitive process that leads to some of the same problems. And so it's famous study in the 30s where they asked people like just to associate to Mexicans or associate to blacks, et cetera, et cetera. And you see that they had all sorts of negative stereotypes. And that the problem with these negative stereotypes is that, I talked about Daniel Kahneman's system 1 versus system 2. Like, it is animal brain stuff. It is immediate reaction of fear and hatred and fight or flight when these ideas emerge. And when you start to bring them up into the forebrain and slowly are forced to think and talk about it, you can then start to mitigate some of the anxiety reactions. Now, this goes to your second question of how easily populations are manipulated by things like xenophobia. So yes, the answer is absolutely. The whole origin of the concept of xenophobia is a topsy-turvy story I discovered because it was actually a concept that was xenophobic itself in its original use. It was a term used about the Chinese that justified occupation of China by the French and the other Western powers. The Chinese were said to be xenophobic for wanting to fight back and attacking Westerners, and that it was said to be a racial thing and then it spread to all the other colonies, that the Africans, the Asians, the Middle Easterners were all lower on the hierarchy of evolution and hadn't realized that these Westerners came in peace and they were gonna bring prosperity and Jesus, and why would you possibly attack us just because we're stealing your land and turning you into indentured servants? That was the original. I was shocked to find this, of course. I thought I'm studying this virtue, and it turns out to be an Orwellian origin used to manipulate populations to say gaslight populations to say, this is a phobia. They have no reason to attack us. Then, over time, there were a lot of terms like this that justified imperialism and the colonial kind of enterprise that end up doing a 180. And so the civilizing mission in French ends up being called, ironically used. The imperialism goes from being a good thing to a bad thing. So with that, xenophobia kind of turns around too, and it's seen not as something that just they do to us, but that we can do to them. And that's happening now in urban populations, where in London, there's xenophobic groups that attack Jews who come from Russia and are immigrants. And in America, you have that with blacks in the South, especially, but also Germans and Italians and other immigrants. So, the term starts to become thought of as an ethic that tries to restrain our own proclivity to demonize others. And do populations fall prey to political programs that want to make us think that way? Absolutely. And one of the earliest critics of this was actually a guy named Walter Lippmann, who was a political journalist. I didn't expect to encounter political journalists in this, but he invented the notion of the stereotype. He took it from printing, because the stereotype was just a kind of way that you printed the same thing over and over, and said it's cognitive too. And what was he worried about? He had been in the propaganda effort during World War I, and he started to realize that the propaganda effort was really dangerous and could lead people to continue killing each other. And then he realized something else was happening, and that other thing was called the movies. And he suddenly saw this future. It's kind of like the digital moment right now, in a way, that he was prescient enough to imagine how super powerful it was going to be to control populations and get them to hate whoever you wanted them to hate with the movies. And that becomes kind of the origins of media is a big, big issue here. And, in these studies, you'd have people who say, I really hate Turks. A lot of people hated the Turks. Why do you hate Turks? Have you ever met a Turk? No, I've never met a Turk. Well, what don't you like about the Turk? Well, I've read about them in the papers, and they say that they do this to their women, and they do this and they do that, and I really hate them. They realized going to be prone to action, to hate crimes, et cetera, simply by the media that they were fed. And that, political powers, of course, took great notice because propaganda is, part of their business.
Yeah. So it's so interesting because I feel like the vaccine, if you will, to this problem is diversity of experience and exposure. And there was a study that was done on rats. Rats come in all kinds of colors. They're not like all white lab rats. They come in grays and browns and blacks and whites and, all the variation of patterns. And they're super empathetic to other rats. There was research that showed that they even didn't go for a treat when a fellow rat was in trouble. They passed up on the treat and instead went and helped a distressed rat. So then the researchers did an experiment where they raised rats together based on their coat colors. And then what they found is that essentially this lack of exposure to what a rat looks like, right? Because presumably they don't look in a mirror, so they know what they are based on all the different types of colored rats that they see. They stopped helping rats that didn't look like them. And
wow.
when I read that, I thought to myself that having diversity of experiences with others when you're young shapes, what you think you are. So now your concept of other is really a reflection of your personal experience. And of course, historically and anatomically modern humans, this is very tribal, right? Like your self is your tribe and your other is not your tribe. And I work in rural Uganda, and now a lot of the kids there, and I mean kids like infants, I had babies look absolutely terrified when they saw me. Not because babies in Uganda are racist and don't like white people, but because I looked so different. They hadn't seen anybody that looked like me. And when I spoke to I think maybe a 1.5-year-old, I said Agandi, which is like, hello. She ran away because now she didn't know how to process that I was speaking the language that she spoke, but I didn't look like her at all. And then another young girl tried to rub my skin, looking under, like somehow had something on my skin that prevented my color from being like hers. But once she realized that was just my skin color, she just forgot about it. And so I feel like, how do we cultivate? And I think that's what desegregation tried to do, I think, right? We were talking about silos of expertise, but this is like silos of self-identification. And I'm feeling like that's coming back with this idea of nationalism around the world. And so does this kind of pattern move in cycles? Like, can we think about what triggers a movement in one way or the other of a resurgence of this kind of problem?
Yeah. No, I think we have to think about it as something that recurs over time in history. And the more that we can understand the specifics of what the kind of, what the setting is, what the context is that it allows for the emergence of, really rabid ethno-nationalism, the better we'll be in terms of trying to prevent it. Look, I argue that one of the central parts of this is, and it's a scary thought, even diversity can be destroyed by authoritarian leaders and groups, and that we're very prone to having, kind of abdicating individual conscience for group conscience, especially in authoritarian groups. So, one of the really most, kind of heartbreaking examples is Spain. And, I talk about what happened in Spain where, I'm talking about how, Moors and Jews and Christians really had a period of time under Moorish control where they lived together very peacefully. and the guy next door to you was, of one religion, and the other person next door was of another religion. And that broke down, and that became an ethno-nationalist, the Inquisition, and the rooting out of the crypto Jews who had converted to Christianity, and the expulsion of both the Moors, the Muslims, and the Jews. That was a march of a couple hundred years from a place where you would have said diversity should have protected them from that. It didn't. And what people find is that people sometimes make exceptions for the good Jew, the good Black. My buddy who I played baseball with, he's a good one, but they still have room in their inner world but most of them aren't good. So, I think that groups and group dynamics, which I think is really not well enough understood, authoritarian leadership, I think all of that is highly problematic stuff that comes and goes throughout time, and is one of the really predictors of the rise of xenophobia, because they use very firm boundaries for in-groups, and that requires a very demonized out-group, right? That is the way of controlling the community. It's not a porous boundary where people come and go. It's us and a very, very clear marker. And everyone's a little anxious about getting kicked out, right? And them, which is someone who is demonized, is super bad, is evil, does things that would horrify any of us, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the way this goes, I talk a lot about the process of projection, where the group is encouraged to project any of their inner distress, their shame about themselves, their sense of inferiority, their guilt, onto the other. And that makes it super, super, I hate to use this word, but kind of like fun. It's a great relief to project this stuff onto someone else. It's a great plus to not have to worry about yourself or feel ashamed. Shame is a especially toxic feeling. It's very, very difficult to tolerate. And you find that, groups that have been, have slipped down the social and economic ladder are prone to these kind of xenophobic solutions, where they project a lot of their shame and their guilt onto some other and feel emboldened and restored to some sort of dignity and pride themselves.
Gosh, you bring up so many good points, and I know we are coming close to the end of our time, and I feel like we could keep talking about this for hours. Some of the things that you mentioned, social conformity, right? Not wanting to be kicked out of the group. There is an enormous pressure to conform to whatever your cultural identity is. And I think that this is something that also is biologically rooted, because we are a social species, and for social species, being alone is pretty darn risky. But I also notice is that there are within a social unit, there's a lack of tolerance for certain behaviors that don't support the health of that system, so to speak. For example, I was talking to someone else recently about conflict, right? Conflict is really bad for individuals within a social group. The tension is too much. So they reconcile very quickly. There isn't some of the things that we see in human dynamics and friendships, relationships of stonewalling or silent treatment. Like, this just creates way too much tension, and individuals have to get on with surviving and cooperating because they live in a social group. So they reconcile conflicts pretty quickly. I imagine if you were an individual that just couldn't reconcile, the rest of the group might just kick you out. And that's pretty
reconcile. Can you tell us a little bit more? Like, does the leader force them to do it, or was there?
No, it's inherent. So, meaning, well, it's in the individual's best interest. So, for example, I guess I was talking about this yesterday, patas monkeys. So let's say two individual monkeys, patas monkeys, have a problem with each other. Now, what do? How do they reconcile? Well, they may not be ready to groom each other. That would be like, we're good. We're totally good. I'm touching you. I'm engaging in a social bonding activity with you. So we're fine. But they will sit in close proximity to each other. That might be enough to say, okay, I'm not ready to touch you yet, but we're okay. Chimps might hug. So there's hugging as a reconciliation. Grooming, I'm specifically thinking about primates, right? But physical proximity, because I mean, if you think about someone you're really angry with, you might say, I don't want to be anywhere near you. I don't even want to look at you right now. So being in physical space, allowing them into your physical space is a form of reconciliation. And that's designed to reduce tension. You must reduce tension, but other animals spend a lot of I don't know why the pre-game time, like tailgating, to reduce social tension. There's a lot of effort put in to avoid conflicts in the first place. But I feel like in humans in particular, there's a tremendous amount of social conformity pressure. And so that can create this sort of, I feel like, clinging to an external identity, meaning your social unit, as a way to justify otherwise unjustifiable behavior. Like it must create a cognitive dissonance or a tension in an individual that I don't want to be on the outs of my community, but my community is demanding or requiring of me to engage in this sort of behavior, whether it's language or conversation or actual actions that go against my own internal sort of, I don't know, compass of behavior.
Right.
And so how much do you think that social conformity plays in these problems? And can we shift to see assimilation and integration as, a positive thing? And what buffers us from the ability of an authoritarian, kind of structure to destabilize that? How can we shore that up so that I don't want to say become immune to xenophobia, but where it cannot penetrate so widespread that it actually takes hold? Is there anything we can do?
Yeah, look, I think there has to be. And I think what we do, is to mitigate that it doesn't become a tidal wave, like that some of this happens as part of life, right? I mean, that you demonize the guy who stole your girlfriend in high school, like, that's just life. That your team, one of the things that we do that's so healthy is we have these kind of pseudo wars based on sports. Like,
Right.
I'm for the Knicks and you're for the Celtics and we hate each other. Well, really?
Yeah.
But honestly, yes, we do.
I know. But that can also bring different groups together in a common enemy against that team.
Exactly. But that in the back of my mind, in the back of our minds, like we're like, no, we don't really. This is ridiculous. So there's a as if quality that I think blows off some steam. But, look, I think the question of ethno-nationalism and organizing a community around a pure fantasy, because it's always a fantasy of some sort of ethnic community. And if that becomes the national community, it's very, very dangerous. And I believe in the United States. I mean, I think the notion of, all men and women are created equal. And we come here because we share a group of principles. And that if you share those group of principles, there's a lot of individual freedom. And there's a sense of that you're part of that community. Your principle. It's not your color of your skin, not, who your great grandparents were. So, I think a lot of other countries have had to manage because they've had very long histories, like France, for instance, that has had a rather long history where a whole bunch of local communities have kind of mostly dissolved into an identity that's national, which is French. Well, 300 years ago, they weren't French. They were Catalan. They were, all sorts of subgroups with dialects that were different and some local governance, et cetera, that was different. So how you create a nation state that's stable and isn't prone to this kind of stuff is, kind of above my pay grade. It is a really, really complicated problem because every nation state in the 19th century, and I argue that this in the book, is that one of the great changes is as feudalism ends and as modernity emerges and the nation state is based on, a notion of no longer an absolute ruler who's pretty close to divine and the church, but rather something else, a national identity, a national myth, things got a lot less certain. And so states became, much more contested in terms of the nature of and the kind of legitimacy of the nation state. So that's a big problem. And one of the things, going back to the big question, one of the big questions you asked is like, why does it happen when it happens, as opposed to other times? My argument for why it's happening now, a lot of people said 2008 when I was looking into this. They said 2008 there was this terrifying, collapse of the economic system. A lot of people suffered deeply, and it was kind of the end of the rosier pictures of globalization. And I think there's something to that. But I actually, when I went back and tried to do research on it, quantitative research, what I found was that actually the claims of xenophobia really started to skyrocket right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so this is maybe not the happiest conclusion, but the conclusion was a lot of common groups in the West had the same enemy. They had a common enemy, and common enemies, organize groups and allow you to then give a lot of freedom within your group. And the group was the West. It was huge. And so Republicans might not like Democrats that much, but they both, mostly in the middle, shared a hatred for Soviet Union's Marxism. When that goes, it was, I argue, highly problematic for the West and for our nation, because that common enemy now disappeared. The way that influenced both kind of a tribal unity, but also a kind of sense that we couldn't get outflanked by people who claim to do better by their workers, et cetera, disappears. And so we have this period of neoliberalism and kind of American New World Order stuff that is like one hand clapping. There is no easy way of communicating what the boundaries of our community was. And now what is it? The Republicans hate not the Russians or the Soviets, and the Democrats hate not the Russians or the Soviets. They hate each other. Yeah. And so this is, in a way, a historical argument that's kind of what happened to the Roman Empire, is that when, in fact, Carthage was finally fully defeated, at least some people argue that that's when civil war started in Rome, that they were a militaristic society. They were used to having an other that they hated that was demonized. And when it was gone, they didn't give up being a militaristic society. They didn't have an enemy, so they found one. So,
Absolutely.
That's a distressing kind of analogy that may or may not be appropriate. I hope it's not, but it might be.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on the lack of optimism that it's not just from the common enemy kind of point of view. Gosh, all right. I hope everybody goes out and gets A Fear in Strangers, A History of Xenophobia. The work you're doing is really fascinating. I love the way you weave together the psychological, psychiatric, and the historical to get us thinking about some of these things that are current problems for us socially. So thank you for writing that book, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's been a real pleasure. Fun to talk to you. Thanks.
From species to societies, we see that some of the same instincts are at play. The desire to categorize, to draw lines between us and them. But as George Makari reminds us, these boundaries are often illusions shaped by fear and history rather than reality. In our next episode, we're going to take a different approach to understanding connection, not through fear, but through deeper listening. I'll be joined by Susan Erich, author of Whispers from the Wild, An Invitation. And we're going to explore what happens when we truly open ourselves to the voices of the natural world. What can we learn when we stop categorizing and start listening? Join us next time to find out. And hey, if you're enjoying the podcast, please give it a like, share it with your friends so that I can keep bringing you these amazing guests.